take some time to enjoy the view. The location of this site, overlooking the junction of the St. Croix and Avon rivers, was key to its role in protecting the lines of communication and travel between Halifax and the Bay of Fundy shores. Fort Edward was originally constructed in 1750 as a part of a series of fortifications built to support the new British base at Halifax. Established in 1749, it is nationally significant because of its role in the struggle for predominance in North America from 1750 to 1812. Its position at the junction of the Avon and St. Croix rivers, as a center of Acadian and Mi'kmaq settlement, helped protect the lines of communication and travel to the Bay of Fundy shores. The fort was built on a square plan with bastions at each corner and was surrounded by a ditch. Earth ramparts and wooden palisades were used to protect fortifications. The buildings inside the fort were constructed in 1748. Fort Edward had accommodations for 8 officers and 168 men. Its armament consisted of one 6-pound gun over there, 5 9-pound guns, and 2 4-pound guns. Fort Edward served as a base of operations for the deportation of the Acadians in 1755, and later saw service during the American Revolution from 1755 to 1783 and the War of 1812. In later years, it served as a training camp for the Canadian militia, now B Company of the West Nova Scotia Regiment. Of the original train buildings, only the blockhouse remains here. The oldest blockhouse in Canada. It is also one of the few mid-18th century buildings still standing in Nova Scotia. Fort Edward became a National Historic Site in 1921. Let's take a look around. Afterwards known as Fort Edward from the Nova Scotia Historical Society. Flora MacDonald, a name that will be mentioned in history, and If Courage and Fidelity Be Virtues, mentioned with honor, written by Samuel Johnson. The preserver of Bonnie Prince Charlie spent the winter of 1779 here with her husband, Captain Allan MacDonald, of the Royal Highland Immigrants. When returning to her old home in Skye, she tracked out for a new home in North Carolina. Her loyalty and devotion in the midst of troubled days have long been told in Scottish song and history. Fort Edward. This area was well populated by Acadians when Halifax was founded. British troops had been observing their settlements for some time before 1750 when Major Charles Lawrence built Fort Edward to forestall a possible attack on Halifax by either Acadians or Indians and to intercept their train with Loutre. In 1755, 1,000 Acadians were deployed from the vicinity of the fort. During the American Revolution, during the War of 1812, the fort was reinforced to protect Windsor and the road to Halifax. The garrison remained here until 1850. Over here is one of the cannons of the original fort. Fort Edward is a National Historic Site of Canada in Windsor, Nova Scotia, formerly known as Biscuit, and was built during Father Loutre's War, 1749 to 1755. The British built the fort to help prevent the Acadian, help with the Acadian exodus from the region. The fort is most famous for the role it played both in the expulsion of the Acadians in 1755 and in protecting Halifax, Nova Scotia from a land assault in the American Revolution. While much of Fort Edward has been destroyed, including the officers' quarters, which burned down in 1922, and barracks, the blockhouse that remains is the oldest extant in North America. A cairn, which is that marker of rocks, was later added to the site. The site is staffed by Parks Canada in the summer months. Father Loutre's War. Despite the British conquest of Acadia in 1710, Nova Scotia remained primarily occupied by ethnic French Catholic Acadians and Mi'kmaq. Father Loutre's war began when Edward Cornwallis arrived with 13 transports on 21st June 1749 to establish Halifax. To guard against the Mi'kmaq, Acadian, and French attacks on the new British Protestant settlements, the latter erected fortifications in Halifax, 1749, Bedford, which is Fort Sackville, in 1749, Dartmouth, Fort Duncan, in 1750, Lunenburg, Blockhouse, 1753, and Lawrencetown, Halifax County, in 1754. This is a map of Fort Edward in 1757. The remaining blockhouse is located within the walls of the fort and is marked with an A. Within 18 months of establishing Halifax, the British took firm control of the peninsular Nova Scotia by building fortifications in all of the major Acadian communities. Present-day Windsor, Fort Edward, Grand Pre, Fort Vaux-Logis, and Chignecto, Fort Lawrence, Halifax County. A British fort, Fort Anne, already existed in the other major Acadian centre of Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. Cobequid was not fortified. Fort Edward was the site of the Acadian church for the parish of l'Assomption, established in 1722. After initially failing to take the settlements of Chignecto, Major Charles Lawrence, on 7th June 1750, he had Acadians destroy their church so that Fort Edward could be built in its place. In early March 1750, the Acadians and Mi'kmaq took 3 English prisoners. Gorham was ordered to Fort Edward. On Gorham's march to Pisiquid to secure the area prior to building Fort Edward, the Rangers engaged the Mi'kmaq in the Battle of St. Croix, in English Nova Scotian slang St. Croix, in 1750. The fort was named by Gorham for Edward Cornwallis, who established Halifax, Nova Scotia. On 9th May 1750, Phillips was fired on by French and native Captain John Rouet, and was in a skirmish off Fort Edward at the same time, where he killed 2 native people whose comrades took their bodies. At first, Alexander Murray commanded at Fort Sackville. In September 1751, he was given command of Fort Edward, where he remained for most of the ensuing 7 years, except for a tour of duty at Halifax in 1753. On 12 December 1752, Murray was charged by the Nova Scotia Council with exploiting the local Acadian community by paying unfair prices for supplies and randomly imprisoning some of the men. Remember, at this time, the Acadians of Joseph Broussard were actively attacking all the English forts, many times Sackville, also Lunenburg, Dartmouth, Halifax. So it's not necessarily randomly imprisoning. They just were trying to catch who was doing it. On 1st November 1753, Captain Hale was relieved by Commander Floyer as the commander of Fort Edward. Fort Edward, Fort Lawrence, and Fort Anne were all supplied by and dependent on the arrival of Captains Cobb, Jeremiah Rogers, or John Taggart in one of the government sloops. These vessels took the annual or semi-annual relief to their destination. So the food in this area for the fort wasn't grown by the fort themselves. They had to be shipped there because of the danger outside the fort. They carried the officers and their families to and from as required. The French and Indian War. From 28 May 1754 to 7 October 1763, which was 9 years, 4 months, 1 week, and 2 days. The location was in North America. It was a British victory, and France ceded New France east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain, retaining Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, which is here off the southern tip of Newfoundland, and transferred Louisiana to Spain. Here is the operations that we're concerned with today. This one. Okay. Here is an image of a soldier of the 47th Regiment of Foot by David Morier in 1751. This is one of what the soldiers looked like who were based here at Fort Edward. Here is Captain Alexander Murray and his signature. Fort Edward played an important role in the Bay of Fundy campaign in 1755 of the Acadian expulsion. Shortly after the Battle of Fort Beausejour, on the eve of the expulsion, the commander of Fort Edward, Captain Alexander Murray, wrote to his wife saying, "The Acadians are in great anxiety, as I am, about their fate." A month later, at exactly the same time as Lieutenant Colonel John Winslow read the expulsion orders in Grand Pré, 5th September at 1500 hours, Captain Murray read the order to the 183 Acadian males he had imprisoned at Fort Edward. On 20th October, 920 Acadians from Pisquid were loaded on to 4 transports. Unlike the neighboring community at Grand Pré, the English did not burn and destroy the buildings at Pisquid. As a result, when the New England planters arrived, many houses and barns were available for use. Fort Edward was one of the 4 forts in which Acadians were imprisoned over the 9 years of the expulsion. The others were at Fort Frederick, St. John, New Brunswick, Fort Cumberland, which is now Fort Beausejour Museum, and Fort Charlotte, George's Island, Halifax, and on average, over a period of 9 years, 350 Acadian prisoners at a time were held in the garrison. Raids on Fort Edward. Both the Acadians and Mi'kmaq resisted the expulsion. In September 1756, a group of 100 Acadians ambushed a party of 13 soldiers of the 47th Regiment of Foot. As we saw that before, here's a soldier of the 47th. The 47th Regiment of Foot originated from, of course, in Great Britain, and they existed from 1741 to 1881. One battalion, and there's 2 battalions later on. They came from Fullwood Barracks in Lancashire, which is also where the traces of the West Nova Scotia Regiment, 40th Regiment of Foot, half of them came from. Their nicknames were the Cauliflowers, the Lancashire Lads, Wolfe's Own, because they were part of General James Wolfe's group, and they were in many battles, including the 1745 Jacobite Rising. So they were part of the soldiers that defeated Bonnie Prince Charlie at Culloden. So they took 7 men prisoner. These guys were just working outside the fort. And they took 7 men prisoner. The Acadians took 7 men prisoner from the 47th, and 6 escaped back to the fort. In April 1757, a band of Acadian and Mi'kmaq partisans raided a warehouse near Fort Edward, killing 13 British soldiers. After taking what provisions they could carry, they set fire to the building. A few days later, the same partisans raided Fort Cumberland, Fort Beausejour. Fort Beausejour, when it became a British fort, changed its name to Fort Cumberland. Because of the strength of the Acadian militia and Mi'kmaq militia, British officer John Knox wrote that in the year 1757, we were said to be the masters of the province of Nova Scotia, or Acadia, which, however, was only an imaginary possession. He said that the situation in the province was so precarious for the British that the troops and inhabitants at Fort Edward, Fort Sackville, and Lunenburg could only be reputed in any other light than as prisoners. In the early 1760s, it was illegal for Acadians to reside in Nova Scotia. Families and individuals who had avoided capture in 1755 were imprisoned. The prison lists for Fort Edward between 1761 and 1762 still exist. For a list of the prisoners, see the list of Acadian prisoners at Fort Edward. And in 1762, one of the most famous prisoners, Acadian Joseph Broussard, Beausoleil, was imprisoned here. Between 1763 and 1764 in the Minas region, the British authorities took 363 Acadians into custody in Fort Edward. Now here is a bit of extra information. Only 7,000 Acadians were actually expelled by the English. Joseph Broussard led 5,000 Acadians to self-deport to New Brunswick. While prisoners, the Acadians were forced to work for the New England planters to establish their farmlands. When the war finished, rather than stay and work as subordinates, the Acadians settled with their compatriots in present-day New Brunswick and Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. The ones that went to New Brunswick now joined with the people of the North Shore, or the northern half of New Brunswick. Notable prisoners would be Acadian Joseph Broussard, Father Henry Daudin, and Father Jacques Gerard. The American Revolution. During the American Revolution, the 84th Regiment of Foot, the Royal Highland Immigrants 2nd Battalion, was stationed at forts throughout Atlantic Canada. Fort Edward was the headquarters of the 84th Regiment in Atlantic Canada. The 84th Regiment had moved from Halifax to Fort Edward to guard against a land assault on Halifax. Throughout the war, Fort Edward housed prisoners taken from American privateering ships. The Jacobite heroine, Flora MacDonald, spent the winter of 1778 to 1779 at the fort with her husband, Alan MacDonald, before she returned alone to Scotland. The War of 1812. Fort Edward was also active during the War of 1812. During this time, the fort continued to protect Nova Scotia against assault by American privateers. Fort Edward remained part of the British defences in Nova Scotia until 1758. This is David Ben-Gurion, who was the future Prime Minister of Israel in his Jewish Legion uniform in 1918. This is a picture of the Jewish Legion here in Fort Edward, Nova Scotia. This is Yom Kippur in 1918. During World War I, it was utilized as a training depot for Canadian and British soldiers. The site became known informally as Camp Fort Edward for the duration of the war. Among the recruits passing through the camp was the ill-fated Hollywood film director William Desmond Taylor. During World War I, the British Army used the fort to establish a training depot for Jewish men training to fight against the Ottoman Turks in Palestine, also known as Israel, and ultimately help Great Britain, France, and America defeat Germany. Known as the Jewish Legion, this unit was stood up for service in 1917, manned by Jews from around the world who came to Windsor for training on the slopes of the fort with Major W.F.D. Bremner. The Legion was made up of battalions 38 to 42, 38-42. At Fort Edward was the 39th Battalion. 1,100 Jewish troops led by Lieutenant Colonel Eliezer Margolin. Bremner lived in Castle Fredericks and is an ancestor of Falmouth James J. Bremner. See the Halifax Provisional Battalion. Pictures and first-hand accounts of the time indicate that the men lived in tents on the hillside below the bulk house. Many of these recruits came with Zionist ideals. Zionism simply means the belief of Israel, that Israel has a right to exist. So they came here with Zionist ideals and dreamed of restored Palestinian, not really Palestinian, Israeli homeland for the Jews. There were already Jews living there. These guys just wanted to be independent of not only the Ottomans, but later on the British as well. In Windsor, Nova Scotia, 1,100 men, non-commissioned officers, were trained. Founders of the Legion included David Ben-Gurion, who became the first Prime Minister of Israel. and Zeev Jabotinsky. Both men were trained at Fort Edward. At age 70, David Ben-Gurion reported on his time at Fort Edward. I will never forget Windsor, where I received my first training as a soldier and where I became a corporal. This is Fort Edward in 1900. Fort Edward National Historic Site. The fort was designated as a National Historic Site in 1920. The blockhouse was additionally designated as a classified federal heritage building in 1994. Here's the blockhouse, here was the officers' quarters, and here was the barracks. Today, only the blockhouse stands.